Hi everyone! In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to use an airbrush to create some simple but very effective backgrounds. Now the first thing that I want to mention here is I do have a photo on the left of the rabbit, the finished background, because as we layer with backgrounds like this that are out of focus, I find that they don't actually look great or make much sense until you've got the subject mapped in and some of that subject painted. So here I just wanted to have a larger version so you can see that throughout this layering process with the airbrush, you have to work through quite a few layers that really don't look good. You just need to keep on layering until you've got the effect that you want. Now my first priority is to cover up the white of the canvas or the panel that I'm painting on. So for this I've gone with that darker brown, it's got a slight greenish tint to it, and as I've said, this is just purely a blocking in stage. Now once this is blocked in, I do want this layer to dry, and then I can start working on building up more of my lights and darks in the background. Now the background in this painting, it's quite simple. It doesn't really make much sense on its own, as I've mentioned at the beginning of this video, but in combination with the subject, with the beautiful contrast and colours of the rabbit, that simple background is therefore far more effective. So I really do want to be focusing on the softness. Now when I create my airbrush backgrounds, I usually am using it to create that out of focus distance look. So here I want to be holding my airbrush a little further away from my surface. Generally, the closer you hold that airbrush to the surface, you're going to get more in focus details or harsher lines. So whenever you want anything that is out of focus and blurry, my biggest tip would be to hold that airbrush a little further away from your painting. Now that layer there has completely dried. This is where I can start refining more of where I want my main lights and darks to go. So here I've got that mixture with more of the black, and this is just enabling me to, as I say, map in those lights and darks. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I talk about mapping in the lights and the darks with any painting. So when I come to working on the subject, that's the first thing I'll do with my base layer stage. And it really is no different with my airbrush. By breaking it up into the main lights and darks, the background portion becomes less overwhelming. Now one thing that can happen when using an airbrush is it's a very fun tool to use. I love using my airbrush, and therefore it's easy to get carried away. But what I'm doing here is studying very closely the direction of my lights and darks, the way that I want them positioned. But the wonderful thing about working with an airbrush is it dries pretty much straight away, and if we create a layer we don't like, we can just simply paint over it, just like when we work with normal acrylics. Now something that I cover in my real-time versions of my tutorials on Patreon is the movement and how to use that airbrush in terms of the trigger on the top. So if you've got a dual action airbrush where you can have control over the air pressure and also the paint flow, you do have to get a little bit more of that precision with how much pressure should be applied to that trigger depending on how much paint you want coming out of that airbrush at one time. Now this of course is far easier for me to explain in this real-time version, so if you would like to follow along to this, see any of my step-by-step tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. Now these clips in this video are sped up slightly, but the one thing that allows you to see is that my mixing well is always facing the ceiling. So the little cup on the top of the airbrush there is where your paint goes in, you can mix your colours and so on. But you always want to be making sure that that is facing the ceiling, because if you tilt your hand, honestly it's very easily done, but if you tilt your hand, all of that paint is going to end up going over your floor and your canvas, and it will obviously create a right mess. So we want to be very aware of that whenever we're using our airbrush. Here is a prime example, it's always facing upwards. Now that I've mapped in my darker sections, I can now start to focus on more of my midtones. Now in order to do this, because I want some of the greens and browns to be a little bit more vibrant, I need to be making sure that that colour underneath is lighter and a bit more opaque. Now if I hadn't have come in with this lighter layer as I'm mapping in my midtones here, and I was to go straight over the top with my greens and browns, they wouldn't be able to show up over my dark base layers. So what I'm having to do here is paint a lighter layer in first, paying very close attention to where I want those colours to be eventually, and then I can wait for that to dry and then apply my colours on top. So if you've got a really vibrant background, this is what I would recommend to do. let's say for instance I wanted this background to have a red tint to it or a purple tint, whatever colour it may be. That will then have that transparency, so it will allow the darker colours to show through, and therefore your bright colour saturation is not going to be as strong. You're going to end up with more dull and darker colours. This green here is only looking as vibrant as that because it's going over the top of a lighter layer. If this was over the dark section, like in this lower corner, it's just not going to look as bright. So if you are working with any colours like this, I would recommend to take that time to put the lighter layer in first and then put your colour over the top. Now the one thing that's noticeable here is I'm not bothering to put any of that airbrush paint over where the rabbit is going to be, but I am making sure that the background portion is going right up to the subject. So I will usually overlap it by about an inch to make sure that there are no sections of the background that are missed out around my subject. I don't want to create a halo, I want this to look like the background was painted first. Now just like with any background, I would recommend to get that completed and that you're happy with that before you start painting your subject. It can be much more of a hassle to go back and adjust your background. It can absolutely be done, but then you have to work around your subject, and if you have to then rework it with your airbrush, that airbrush paint will get dispersed over your subject to some degree, so you'd have to go back to your animal and then touch up some of the edges. So I would recommend, if you can, get your backgrounds finished before you start painting the main subject. Now here I felt like I needed to hype up my contrast, so I've come back in with a darker green, a little bit of a brown mixture, and I'm now adding in more of those darker tones. Now this layering process, it is far easier to do with an airbrush, as you can see. One of the more common questions I'm asked is, can you create this effect with traditional brushwork? Now yes, absolutely, you can create soft out of focus backgrounds. I've got lots of tutorials on Patreon showing how to do that, but it does take far longer. And the airbrush does have more of that softness to it. It does create a little bit more of a unique look. You can get soft out of focus backgrounds with a brushwork, but it is something that's going to take a significant amount of time to achieve. There is also a real technique to it. So you don't want to allow the paint to dry, you want to be using more specific blending brushes. But again, if that's something that you would like to see covered in tutorials, then I've got lots available on my Patreon channel. Now again, this is all about a layering process. This is something I talk about in all of my tutorials. I could have easily have called the background finished before I started adding more highlights, but I just wanted a little bit more depth in my background. So all I'm doing here is coming in with more of that lighter mixture and then waiting for that to dry, which is pretty much instant. And then again, I can adjust the colour with more of my vibrancy. Now, one question that I'm asked fairly frequently is whether or not it's worth investing in an airbrush setup. Now, of course, this is going to be really individual to each artist. I love using my airbrush, and for me, it means that I don't have to spend hours blending my backgrounds with traditional brushwork. So it actually saves me a huge amount of time with the number of acrylic paintings that I do. So for me, it was a tool that I wanted to invest in. But if you're only looking to create these out of focus backgrounds, you don't need a super duper airbrush. You know, you can start off with something that's a little bit more basic. Now, that being said, I do recommend still getting a good brand. You do definitely want to be making sure that whatever airbrush setup you buy, that you can buy replacement parts. You don't want to buy something that is cheaper and then have one of the needles break, for instance, and then you can't replace that needle, so you end up needing a whole new setup. So whatever one you decide on, I would just recommend that you can get those replacement parts, because otherwise it's going to end up costing a lot more money in the long run. Now, my very first airbrush that I used was the Iwata Neo airbrush. I loved it. It was brilliant and it worked great for backgrounds like this. Now, the airbrush that I'm using here is more advanced. You can change the needle sizes, but for this out of focus effect, you really don't need that. Now, the airbrushes that I have used so far have been a dual action airbrush. So that means you have control over the air pressure and also the paint flow. And this therefore gives you much more flexibility with the effects that you can create. So I really would recommend to have that option if you are looking to invest in an airbrush. Now, regarding the paints that I like to use, I've got a couple of brands. I like the Golden's High Flow paint, and I also use the Aero colour as well. Now I did used to use Createx airbrush paint, but I had a real issue with that paint being significantly thicker and it kept clogging my airbrush. So I have switched over to the other two brands because they're more of an ink consistency and you don't have to thin those with water. But if you are using Createx, they're a wonderful paint, but you will need to add a bit more water to that mixture in order to prevent that airbrush from clogging. And when I add my paint to my airbrush, I do just use 1 or 2 drops of that colour directly into the mixing well at the top. Now when I want to change colour, that's a little bit different. I'll just rinse that top mixing well with some water and then run that water through my airbrush, get rid of that colour and then start over with the colour adjustment. Now it's not every time that I do that, but for instance here where I've gone from a dark colour to now more of my lighter opaque colour, that's where I do want to make sure that I've got rid of all of that dark paint, because of course it's going to mix with this white and you're going to end up with something that's not as bright. Now one top tip here is you can see to the right hand side of my airbrush on the piece of board that my panel is stuck to, that you can see splodges of paint. Now what I've done there is whenever I do a main colour change in my airbrush, I will always test that colour out on a bit of board to the side of me, because there will be about 1 centimetre or so before you've mixed that colour to the end of the needle that will have the previous colour there. So you want to remove that if you want to start using your new colour right away. So don't put your new colour in the top of your mixing well and then start painting directly onto your surface, because of course you need to have that existing paint that's left over in that airbrush removed first. So all I do with that, as I've said, is just have that little scrap bit of board to the side of me and therefore make sure that the new colour has started to be able to leave that airbrush before I start working back on my painting. Now regarding the colour changes, because this is another important thing here, is where I've used a lighter colour to map in that opaque layer and now I've come back in with my greens, I would have removed all of the white from that mixing well first, because if that mixes in with the green, I'm going to end up with a lighter pale pastel green rather than this bright colour saturation that I've got currently. So those are times when I would recommend to clean your airbrush completely. Now you don't have to strip it down and get rid of all of the paint internally that way. I do that after every painting session. But just for the main colour changes, I do run water through the top of the mixing well and then get rid of all of that through keeping my finger on that airbrush trigger. Get rid of all of that paint and then you can start that new colour. That's very important, otherwise you're going to end up with the colours looking really murky and you're just not going to have the effect that you're going for. But as always, if you've got any questions about that or anything art related, then feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help. I do get quite a lot of airbrush questions, so I'm always happy to also make another video covering something specific if necessary. So here is a photo of my painting. I do hope that the tips I've shared in this video have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching. If you would like to paint along to this real-time version, then my Patreon is all linked in the description below.